In the dying light of Rome's shadow, where marble dreams crumble beneath the weight of forgotten sins, there exists a tale that history chose to bury beneath layers of imperial dust and manufactured silence. The scribes never recorded it. The senators never spoke its name. The emperor's chroniclers erased every trace of the man who dared to forge defiance in the heart of the eternal city, who hammered rebellion into iron and shaped conscience into steel. Yet the echoes remain, whispering through the catacombs like the breath of ghosts who refuse to surrender their truths to the hungry darkness of time. Listen, for this is the story of Marcus Ferrum, master of the forge, keeper of secrets, and the architect of Rome's most forbidden creation. His hands, scarred by countless hours at the anvil, would craft something that the empire feared more than barbarian hordes, or plague, or famine. He would forge hope itself into metal, and for that transgression, Rome would try to make him disappear as completely as if he had never drawn breath beneath her 7 hills. The year was the 37th of Emperor Hadrian's reign, when the Great Wall still bled fresh mortar, and the conquered lands groaned beneath the weight of Roman order. Marcus worked in the depths beneath the Circus Maximus, in a forgotten chamber where the sound of hammer against steel was swallowed by stone and shadow. The air hung thick with the metallic taste of blood and sweat, where gladiators' weapons were born in flame and shaped by hands that understood the delicate balance between protection and destruction. But if you have ever wondered about the hidden stories that shaped the very foundations of empire, about the moments when single souls stood against the tide of history itself, then perhaps you too understand why some truths demand to be told. No matter how deeply they have been buried, Marcus was no ordinary smith. His father had served the legions, his grandfather before him, and the family name was carved in bronze upon the records of the Praetorian Guard. Yet in the depths of his workshop, surrounded by the tools that had belonged to 3 generations of loyal servants to Rome, Marcus harbored a secret that would have seen him crucified along the Appian Way if discovered. He had learned to read not just Latin and Greek, but the ancient tongue of the Iceni, the hill people of Britannia, whose queen Boudica had once made Rome tremble with the fury of her rebellion. The Iceni, who remained after the Great Uprising, had been scattered to the corners of the empire. Their language forbidden, their customs erased, their children raised as Romans with no knowledge of their true heritage. They worked in the mines, they served in the kitchens, they cleaned the floors of the very Senate that had declared their culture extinct. They were the invisible, the unnamed, the deliberately forgotten. Rome had not killed them with sword and fire, for that would have been wasteful. Instead, the empire had chosen a slower, more thorough death. It had decided to erase them from memory itself, to make them disappear 1 generation at a time until even their ghosts would speak only Latin. Marcus had first encountered them in the workshops beneath the amphitheatre, where broken weapons came to be reforged and armor came to be mended. They worked in silence, these remnants of a conquered people, their eyes downcast, their voices never raised above a whisper. But in the moments when the overseers looked away, when the guards dozed at their posts, Marcus heard fragments of their ancient tongue drifting through the smoky air, like prayers to gods whose names had been forbidden. It was old Brennus who first trusted him with the truth. Brennus, whose back bore the scars of Roman whips, but whose spirit remained unbroken despite 40 years of servitude. He spoke in whispers of children who were torn from their mothers' arms if they dared to sing the old songs, of elders who were sold to distant provinces if they attempted to pass down the stories of their ancestors. The empire had decreed that the Iceni culture must die, not through massacre, but through systematic erasure, through the slow starvation of memory itself. "They fear us still," Brennus had whispered to Marcus one night, as the forge fires burned low and the shadows danced like spirits across the workshop walls. "Not our swords, for we have none, not our numbers, for we are few. They fear what we remember, what we carry in our hearts. They know that somewhere in the dark corners of the empire, the old blood still flows, and the old words still have power. Marcus learned their language in secret, practiced their customs in the privacy of his chambers, and slowly came to understand the depth of Rome's campaign of cultural annihilation. The Iceni were not to be killed outright, for that would create martyrs. Instead, they were to be allowed to fade away, to become Romans in all but blood, until the day came when the last speaker of their tongue would die in obscurity, and their entire heritage would vanish as if it had never existed. It was during the month of Martius, when the spring rains turned the city's streets to rivers of mud, that Marcus first heard whispers of the emperor's new decree. The Praetorian Guard spoke in hushed tones of orders that had been sealed with Hadrian's personal mark, of preparations being made for what they called the final cleansing. Marcus felt ice form in his veins as he pieced together fragments of overheard conversations, glimpses of documents that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The remaining Iceni, scattered though they were across the empire's workshops and mines and kitchens, were to be relocated to the furthest reaches of Germania, beyond the wall that bore the emperor's name. There, in the frozen wastes where civilization gave way to wilderness, they would be left to face the coming winter with nothing but the clothes on their backs. It was to be presented as a mercy, as an opportunity for these loyal subjects of Rome to establish new settlements in frontier territory. But Marcus understood the truth that no scroll would ever record. It was death by exposure, death by starvation, death by the slow, grinding wheel of indifference. It was murder, disguised as policy, genocide hidden behind the mask of administrative efficiency. The orders were to be carried out in absolute secrecy. No records would be kept, no names would be spoken. The Iceni would simply disappear one night, loaded into wagons bound for destinations that existed on no official maps. And when questions were asked about their whereabouts, the answers would be shrugs and confusion, as if these people had never existed at all. Rome had perfected the art of making the inconvenient vanish without leaving so much as a bloodstain to mark their passing. Marcus knew he could not stand against the might of the empire with sword or spear. He was one man, a craftsman whose greatest weapon was his hammer, whose greatest shield was the anonymity of his trade. But in the depths of his workshop, surrounded by the tools and materials that had shaped a lifetime of loyal service to Rome, an idea began to take root like a seed in fertile darkness. If he could not fight the empire's armies, perhaps he could outwit its bureaucracy. If he could not save the Iceni with force, perhaps he could save them with cunning. The weapon he began to design was unlike anything the legions had ever carried into battle. It was not a sword meant for killing or a spear meant for piercing. It was something far more dangerous to an empire built upon the careful management of information and the strategic deployment of ignorance. Marcus began to forge documents. Working by candlelight in the hours before dawn, he crafted seals that bore the perfect impression of official marks, papers that carried the precise weight and texture of imperial parchment. He studied the handwriting of scribes and bureaucrats until he could reproduce their letters with flawless accuracy. He learned the language of Roman administration, the careful phrases and coded terminology that could move mountains of paperwork with the stroke of a stylus. The weapon took shape slowly, carefully, like a blade cooled gradually to prevent cracking. Marcus created transfer orders that would reassign Iceni workers to distant provinces, but not to the frozen wastes of Germania. Instead, they would be scattered to Egypt, to Gaul, to Hispania, to places where they might disappear into the vast machinery of the empire, but where they would at least have a chance to survive. He forged medical exemptions for the elderly and the infirm, documents that would declare them too valuable to the war effort to be relocated. He crafted adoption papers that would transform Iceni children into Roman citizens, giving them new names and new families, but preserving their lives. Each document was a masterwork of deception, a lie so carefully constructed that it would pass the scrutiny of any official who did not know to look for forgery. Marcus worked with the precision of a master craftsman, understanding that a single misplaced mark or poorly chosen word could doom not only himself, but every soul he sought to save. He was forging armor made of paper and ink, shields crafted from bureaucratic procedure, weapons that could cut through the machinery of oppression without ever drawing blood. But the greatest challenge was not in creating the documents themselves. It was in placing them within the vast network of Roman administration at precisely the right moments to prevent the machinery of erasure from grinding forward. Marcus would need accomplices, allies who could carry his forgeries into the offices where they would do their work, who could ensure that the false orders reached their destinations before the true ones could be acted upon. It was Brennus who provided the solution. The old Iceni had spent 40 years learning the rhythms of Roman authority, mapping the flow of power through the endless corridors of bureaucracy. He knew which clerks could be bribed, which guards could be distracted, which officials were too drunk or too lazy to examine documents too closely. Together, they began to assemble a network of the desperate and the disillusioned, the slaves and the forgotten, who had their own reasons to see Rome's plans fail. There was Lucia, a scribe in the offices of the Praetorian prefect, whose brother had disappeared into the salt mines for the crime of speaking Egyptian in public. There was Gaius, a courier who had lost his farm to the tax collectors and now carried messages for coin without caring what those messages contained. There was old Tertius, a night watchman who had seen too many good men die for the glory of emperors and now cared more for wine than for duty. One by one, Marcus and Brennus recruited them with whispered promises and carefully counted silver, until they had assembled an invisible army of the overlooked and the undervalued. The plan required timing as precise as the movement of the stars. The orders for the Iceni's removal were scheduled to be distributed during the Ides of Aprilis, when the spring campaigns demanded the attention of every military commander, and the bureaucracy would be too overwhelmed to examine routine transfers too carefully. Marcus's forgeries would need to reach their destinations no more than 3 days before the authentic orders, close enough to appear legitimate, but early enough to be acted upon first. As the appointed day approached, Marcus felt the weight of what he had undertaken settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead. He was not merely defying an emperor's decree. He was challenging the fundamental assumption upon which Rome's power rested, the belief that the empire had the right to decide who lived and who died, who was remembered and who was forgotten. He was asserting that there existed loyalties higher than allegiance to the state, truths more important than the convenience of power. The night before the operation began, Marcus stood in his workshop surrounded by the tools of his trade, knowing that he might never see them again. The hammers that had shaped 1,000 blades, the anvil that had rung with the music of creation, the forge that had burned like a star in the darkness of the earth. If his plan failed, if even one of his forgeries was discovered, the Praetorian Guard would come for him with chains and questions, and he would disappear as completely as the Iceni themselves were meant to vanish. But as he looked upon the documents spread across his workbench, each one a small miracle of precision and desperate hope, Marcus felt something that had been absent from his life for too long. He felt the satisfaction of a craftsman who had created something worthy of his skill, the peace of a man who had chosen principle over survival. Whether he lived or died, whether his name was remembered or erased, he had forged something that Rome could not destroy. The knowledge that at least one citizen of the empire had chosen mercy over obedience. The first phase of the operation unfolded like clockwork, fashioned by the gods themselves. Lucia slipped Marcus's forgeries into the official pouches that would carry them to distant provinces, where commanders would read orders to reassign valuable Iceni workers to new posts that existed only in Marcus's imagination, but which sounded plausible enough to be acted upon. Gaius carried messages that would delay the departure of transport wagons long enough for the false orders to take effect. Old Tertius ensured that certain documents never reached their intended recipients, that certain orders were misfiled in archives where they would gather dust until the moment for action had passed. One by one, across the sprawling expanse of the empire, Iceni families received news that they were being transferred to new assignments. Instead of the death sentence of Germania's frozen wastes, they found themselves bound for Egypt's warm shores, for Gaul's fertile valleys, for Hispania's prosperous cities. They did not know that their salvation had been forged in a workshop beneath the Circus Maximus by a Roman smith who had chosen conscience over comfort. They knew only that they had been granted a reprieve from the fate that awaited their kin. For 3 days, Marcus's invisible army worked its quiet magic throughout the machinery of Roman administration. Documents appeared where they needed to appear, orders vanished when they needed to vanish, and the great engine of imperial authority continued to function without realizing that its gears had been subtly altered to serve a different master. It was a masterpiece of subversion, a rebellion conducted not with sword and shield, but with ink and parchment. But on the 4th day, the trap that Marcus had always known was waiting finally closed around him. It was Quintus Maximus, a junior clerk in the Office of Military Records, who first noticed the discrepancy. A sharp-eyed young man eager to advance his career by demonstrating his attention to detail, he observed that certain transfer orders bore dates that did not align with the official schedule. His investigation revealed documents that seemed authentic, but which contradicted other, equally authentic papers. Within hours, his discovery had reached the attention of men whose job it was to smell treason in the wind. The Praetorian Guard came for Marcus at dawn, their bronze-shod boots echoing through the corridors like the footsteps of fate itself. They found him at his forge, working on an ordinary gladius for an ordinary customer, his hands steady despite the knowledge that his time had run out. He did not resist when they bound his wrists with chains. He did not protest when they led him through the streets toward the Palatine Hill, where questions would be asked that no man could answer and survive. The interrogation took place in a windowless chamber deep beneath the imperial palace, where the walls wept moisture and the air tasted of fear and old blood. Marcus sat in silence as his captors laid out the evidence of his crime, the forged documents, the testimony of accomplices who had been broken by pain and promises, the careful reconstruction of his plot to save the very people Rome had decreed should disappear. He confirmed nothing, denied nothing, explained nothing. He had made his choice, and no amount of suffering could unmake it. But in the end, it was not pain that loosened his tongue. It was the realization that his story, like the stories of the Iceni themselves, was in danger of vanishing without trace. The guards who questioned him spoke of erasure, of the systematic removal of all evidence that Marcus Ferrum had ever existed. His name would be struck from the records, his workshop would be sealed and forgotten. Even the gladiators who had carried his weapons into the arena would never know the identity of the smith who had crafted their steel. It was then that Marcus began to speak, not to save himself, but to ensure that someone, somewhere, would remember what had been done in the darkness beneath Rome's glory. He told them of his discovery of the Iceni's fate, of his decision to forge documents that would save lives rather than destroy them, of the network of forgotten souls who had risked everything to preserve something precious that the empire had marked for extinction. He spoke knowing that his words would be written down, that somewhere in the vast archives of imperial records The truth would survive, even if the man who spoke it did not. The sentence, when it came, was both merciful and terrible. Marcus would not be crucified or thrown to the beasts or burned alive in the arena. Instead, he would simply cease to exist. His name would be erased from every record. His property would be confiscated. His family would be told that he had died in a workshop accident, his body consumed by fire. He would be shipped to a remote outpost beyond the Empire's borders, where he would live out his days as a nameless exile, forbidden ever to speak his true name or reveal his origin. On the night before his departure, as Marcus sat in a cell beneath the Palatine Hill, listening to the distant roar of the city above, he allowed himself to wonder about the fate of those he had tried to save. Had his forgeries succeeded in scattering the Iceni to the far corners of the empire, where they might preserve their language and their customs in secret? Had children been spared the slow death of cultural erasure? Had the old stories found new voices to carry them into an uncertain future? He would never know the answers to those questions. But in the darkness of his cell, as the hours crawled toward dawn and exile, Marcus felt something that his captors could never understand. He felt the satisfaction of a craftsman who had created a masterwork, who had forged something beautiful and true in the face of overwhelming odds. His weapons had been made not of steel and bronze, but of hope and defiance, and they had struck blows that would echo long after his name had been forgotten. When morning came, Marcus was loaded into a wagon bound for the furthest reaches of Britannia, where the wall that bore Hadrian's name held back the painted warriors of the northern tribes. He carried with him nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that he had chosen correctly when choice had mattered most. Behind him, Rome continued its ancient dance of conquest and administration, unaware that a small crack had appeared in the foundation of its certainty. The Iceni whom Marcus had saved scattered like seeds on the wind, carrying within themselves the memory of a language that Rome had tried to kill. In Egypt, a young mother sang lullabies in the old tongue to children who would grow up free. In Gaul, an elderly storyteller preserved the tales of heroes whose names had been forbidden in their homeland. In Hispania, craftsmen worked symbols of their ancestors into pottery and jewelry that would outlast the empire itself. They did not know the name of the Roman smith who had forged their salvation, but they lived because he had chosen mercy over obedience, truth over convenience. Years passed, and the great wheel of history turned as it always had, grinding the proud and the humble alike beneath its inexorable weight. Emperors rose and fell, legions marched and died, and the eternal city continued to devour the world with patient hunger. But in quiet corners of the empire, where shadows gathered and memories were kept like treasures hidden from thieves, the story of Marcus Ferrum was whispered from one generation to the next. The scribes never recorded it. The historians never mentioned it. The official chronicles of Hadrian's reign contained no reference to a smith who had forged rebellion in the darkness beneath the Circus Maximus. But the truth survived nonetheless, preserved in the songs of the Iceni and the dreams of those who understood that empires built upon lies must eventually crumble beneath the weight of their own contradictions. In the end, Marcus's true masterpiece was not the documents he had forged or the lives he had saved. It was the proof that even in the heart of Rome's darkness there had existed men who chose light over shadow, who preferred the dangerous truth to the comfortable lie. He had demonstrated that the mightiest empire in the world could be challenged not by barbarian armies or foreign kings, but by a single soul who refused to accept that power, granted the right to erase the innocent from memory itself. And so the story endures, carried forward by voices that remember when empires forget, preserved in the hearts of those who understand that some truths are too precious to surrender to the hungry silence of official history. The forbidden weapon that Marcus Ferrum forged in his workshop beneath the earth was neither sword nor spear, neither fire nor poison. It was hope itself, hammered into shape by conscience and tempered in the flames of justice. And though Rome sought to destroy all trace of the man who created it, the weapon he made continues its work across the centuries, reminding each generation that stands before the choice between complicity and courage that the most powerful empires can be toppled by the simple act of refusing to forget those whom power seeks to erase. Listen to these whispers from the buried places where truth makes its home, where the echoes of ancient choices still shape the world we inherit. And remember that in your own time, in your own moment of testing, the ghost of Marcus Ferrum stands beside you at the forge, waiting to see what weapons you will choose to craft against the darkness, what light you will kindle in the shadow of empire, what hope you will hammer into being when hope seems lost forever.